Good morning. Hemshech Ayin Beis, volume 3. We finished the paragraph on page 1299. And to sum up briefly, Rabbi Rashab asked on 1298, Havaya Yechatu Merivov is only eliminating the enemy. And much greater than that is transforming the enemy, transforming the prosecutor into the prosecution into a defense, the prosecutor into a defender. So he explained that there are indeed both levels. And he just to sum up, he said that Havaya Yechatu Merivov, in order to eliminate the opponent, even of Gedusha, Gevurah of Gedusha, of Zah. So you have Gevurah, B'nai Elikim, challenging and saying this person or these people need to be judged. So it's challenging Havaya, Ish Milchama, Havaya of Zah. So the way we deal with it, we go deeper, he said, through the Avodah of Amshach and Teda Mitzvahs, Bagdamas Avad of Chol Meidecha, which is Simcha Shal Mitzvah. We draw down a higher level of Havaya Shabbatzmus, which is generally Havaya de La'ela, which he explained earlier, comes from Keser, and even higher before the Tzimtzum, and that eliminates, it transcends and eliminates, because less small of a Hayatika, there's no negative, there's no small Gevurah in that higher level. And you're drawing down Teis V'Sedus, and through that you eliminate the judgments. How do we transform? By Yapich, Hashem Elokecha Lecha. How do we create Haficha? This is not just Yechatu eliminating. So he said that's through Tshuva Ma'ava. Tshuva Ma'ava transforms deliberate sins, Dainis, to Zachis, to merits. And because you're reaching the Hela Ma'atzmi, and we see by Baal Tshuva the deeper intensity, the Cheli Yatir, Mashkele, Becheli Yatir, far more strength and intensity, and that creates a higher power that transforms. And he goes on to explain that mitzvahs leisas are higher than mitzvahs sesa. And I did indeed look it up in the Kutte explains it there at length. Actually, it's very worthwhile reading inside. I was even considering reading it here, but I think he says enough here. But there he basically makes the case that he asked the question, how could a leisas, which is not doing something, be greater than doing something? So he answers, because a mitzvah's leisas, because a mitzvah can to draw down energy that has definitions and parameters, for that a mitzvah says. If you want to draw down energy that's beyond parameters, you need something, there's no keli for it. It's only through not doing something. He doesn't talk there, interestingly, the idea that he speaks about here, which is the opponent that the enemy draws out and awakens something in the king who's fundamentally above it all, as he says it here. There he talks more that it's an Ur that's higher than Kalim. If you want to reach an Ur that is essentially a state of complete Helam, you have to, Helam, like Helam Ha'atzmi, you need to have a Leisasa. But it definitely fits into the discussion here. Here the Rebbe Rashab used the example of a Merumam Ba'etzem, someone who's completely removed. There's nothing you can do for him. There's no mitzvah sesa that's going to affect him because he doesn't need anything. Like he said, or rather, better put, he's so above it all, exalted, that called Dover God. So it doesn't grasp me. It doesn't have any value or significance for him. But a lav, but when you defy or you reject his opponents, which is a leisasa, you avoid the things that God despises. That does me'erer even a merumam, as we learned at the bottom of page 1298. So that's a leisasa. Like pain that reaches deeper than pleasure, as he says at the parentheses close to the bottom. Now with tshuva, it goes even a step further. Because tshuva is not just you refrain from the negative, you actually unfortunately transgressed. But you turn the transgression to become something that's a merit. So that which was despised by God, you've turned into now a merit that God enjoys. Rotze, he says, u'makubal etzlei. That's what shuvah does. Rotze makubal. And this is even higher than the lav. So the lav reaches the Reima Musa Atzmus, which a mitzvah says the positive mitzvah does not reach. But to reach even higher than that, that the lav actually to reach the Helama Atzmi is what causes a transformation, that the lav becomes hein. So it becomes that which was negative became positive, and then more than that, the negative itself became a positive, because we're talking about an action. That's why he said Elisha said itself cannot draw, does not reveal anything. It's not being mamshech anything. It affects a deeper level above, but to draw down, you're actually the zodna was an actual action, and you've turned that action into a positive action. And my amshacha, the amshacha now is helama atzmi, as opposed to a positive mitzvah, which drew down the giluyim of elikus. Now you're drawing down helama atzmi, that's even higher than remus atzmi. And then the last section that we learned on page 1299 was, and this is the general concept of tshuva that transforms the negative into a positive, the prosecution into the prosecutor into a defense, the prosecution into defense, kateger nasa saneger, and lamaila, that means that the judgments of the negatives of the left side, midas hadin, were transformed into chesed and rachmim, elikim bereiv chazdecha. Elikim, as was pointed out, Gevurah, din bereiv chazdecha, not just chesed, reiv chazdecha. Like he says that because it comes down to, like he explained, amitis, the true sweetening of the judgments is when the judgments are turned into love, and that's an intense love. And this we accomplish through tshuva that transforms the negative into the positive, the evil into the good. And then the final piece, he went back, and I want to elaborate a bit more. I read it a little quickly, but I'll just sum it up. That what about Ava B'chol Moedecha? We learned earlier that Ava B'chol Moedecha, which precedes Torah mitzvahs, allows us to reach levels that are higher than just Eris and Kalim. So on previous page, so this was back on page where we first learned it, was when he spoke about it right here. Page 1287, where he said, Ubafrat. So he said that that's what Torah mitzvahs with Ava B'chol Moedecha does, that it goes higher than Shem Havai of mitzvahs. It brings a new energy, and it draws it all the way down below. Just want to see the exact words that he uses there. And that the kalim themselves should become not just the kalim should draw down And there he said, B'frat ayidei tshuva. But now on page 1280 or 1289, he made it clear. 1298, I'm sorry. On page 1298, he made it clear that tshuva is deeper. That Ava B'chol Moedecha, though it's greater than regular mitzvahs, and it draws down to eliminate the enemies, but to transform them, you need tshuva ma'ava. Now he comes back and says also avodah of tzaddikim, essentially. Well, he doesn't say tzaddikim. Let me take back that word. He says v'chein ba'avodah b'chol moedecha bo dafke min ha'meitzar. So he's adding now a new scenario. You can have ava b'chol moedecha that's more than just regular love and Torah mitzvahs that's done regularly, but you're doing it with a more intensity of being completely consumed with godliness, like we learned. And that thus transforms the container into oir. But now he's adding, when it's done min ha'meitzar, which means that a person feels a constraint, feels that tension. From the many concealments and coverings of the animal soul, that reaches the Magbetzam Neshama and transforms the very personality of the animal soul. What he's saying here is that basically in Ava B'chol Moedecha, you have something similar like Tshuva Ma'ava. Tshuva Ma'ava, obviously, it's in the fullest form of expression, because Tshuva Ma'ava is Zdeinus Naslei Kazachis. He's not saying now that there's Zdeinus. He's saying the animal soul, the very personality of the animal soul is transformed. But he does associate Ava B'chol Moedecha. He adds the dimension of Meitzar, which has something similar to Tshuva. Because what causes the Baal Tshuva to have so much intensity? Because he came from a negative place, from a parched place, from thirst, from deep thirst. So there's something similar in Ava B'chol Ma'idecha. By Dezem Amshir B'chinas Helam Ha'atzmi She'yir B'gili. That the Helam Ha'atzmi She'yir B'gili. Okay. So he does add now that the Ava B'chol Ma'idecha has an element, but it seems like the condition is it has to be Min HaMeitzah, which would seem to indicate that let's say you had the level not just B'chol Vavcha, B'chol Nafshecha, but also B'chol Ma'idecha, but it's not Min HaMeitzah. You're going to a very high level, like we learned earlier, completely consumed with godliness, the highest level, like it's Negei B'nefesh, but not necessarily that it came from a Min HaMeitzah of the Nefesh Abamis. That would seem to suggest that it would only have the power to eliminate the judgments, not to transform them. Here, it looks like you can transform the animal soul through when there's a Min HaMeitzah. But I can't say this definitively. But and especially considering that later the Rebbe Rashab is going to start talking about the difference between tzaddikim and balei tshuva on page 1306, he's going to start seeking the difference between the tshuva of a tzaddik and the tshuva of a bal tshuva, which I think will help understand this piece as well better. But for now, suffice it to say that Ava B'chol Ma'idecha can be seen, like he said in the previous page, as only an eliminator of opponents, but not a transformer. Now he seems to add Min HaMeitzah, so therefore it also has the ability to transform. But it's interesting, he doesn't say it transforms sins into transgressions, into merits. It transforms the animal soul, the very personality of the animal soul. But it doesn't just eliminate it, it transforms it. That's very clear. Nepach. So there is an element of transformation through the Ava B'chol Ma'idecha that comes Min HaMeitzah. Okay, but that's fine because there are many levels here. So we have real tshuva on total transgressions. We have Ava B'chol Ma'idecha that comes from a state of distress, Min HaMeitzah. We have a state of Ava B'chol Ma'idecha that may not have distress, and that would not be that would be an elimination of opponents, but not a transformation. And perhaps we'll learn that too can have more dimensions, but we haven't gotten there yet. So that's what I wanted to say. Then finally, he ties together one more big knot, and that is what he goes back earlier. Remember that everything was in the level of Malchus. Malchus is the moon. Malchus, like he says, Amshach is the Ikr B'chinas Malchus. This Amshach is primarily a Malchus, the Amshach of what? Of the Helam Ha'atzmi, because Malchus is a Helam, the Etzem. Less Lamer Gama Klum. Malchus doesn't have anything on its own. It's rooted in Atzmus Ein Sof, in the Helam Ha'atzmi. And that's why the primary containers, which are not Ur, and the primary Ikar B'chinas Helam is all in Malchus. So that's why the primary place where Helam Ha'atzmi will be revealed when we do this deeper Avodah that reaches all the way, it will be in Malchus. And that's where Malchus will become a Gilim Etzad Atzmei, not as it's receiving light from Zah, but its own Ki Mashahim B'atzma B'chinas Etzem Choshech. It's fundamentally on its own a dark state. That itself will become a revelation of godliness. As we learned earlier, not just Havayu Elikim, not just the moon will shine, not just the sun will shine through the moon, not just the Ur will shine through the Keli, the Neshama through the body, but the body itself will reveal its fundamental core source, which is higher than the soul and higher than the Ur and higher than the sun and higher than Zah. And that's why the body will actually feed the soul. Neshama Nezunis Min Haguf, as we learned earlier. He doesn't mention that right here because we said it already. But here clearly he's talking about that full transformation that comes through the Helam Ha'atzmi. And that's what we learned up to this point, to this end of this paragraph. Does anybody have any questions?
Yes. When the Rebbe here is saying Tshuva Me'ava, is he referring to Me'ava Rabbah? I thought it had to be Me'ava Rabbah to do his tafka. Or is he just saying regular Ava, not Ava Rabbah?
When you say what Ava Rabbah B'chol Meidecha?
No, he says here that he does Tshuva Me'ava. Where is it? Tshuva Me'ava. He says that a few times, I think, right here.
Yeah, so it's a Gemara in Yuma. that tshuva madhira does not transforms transgressions into mizdenis, into shgoges. A deliberate transgressions, it weakens it and turns it into like inadvertent ones. And it's tshuva ma'ava, the Gemara in Yuma says this. Turns denis kazachis. So that's clearly, yeah.
And I think Tanya refers to tshuva me'ava rabba, a higher level.
Not necessarily. Ava Rabbi here is not the emphasis here. Because the Gemara says tshuva ma'ava, doesn't use ava rabba.
Right. But doesn't Tanya use that term? Only through the level
Tanya
of
is based on the Gemara in Yuma. The Tanya is not coming instead of the Gemara. The Tanya is based on the Gemara. He may be explaining it. I don't know. I didn't look at the language in Tanya. You have it in front of you?
No, I didn't take it in front of me.
You have to see inside how exactly the language that he says there. But the Tanya is not instead of Gemara. It's based on this Gemara.
I understand. But I think he makes a distinction there, but I'd have to review it. From Ava and Ava Rabba, two different levels.
Regarding our discussion here, it's really the same.
They're not making the distinction. And the second question I have is, what this nefesh neshama that's maruma, nefesh maruma, it seems here, it says here that person's not interested, that mitzvah ase can't affect it. Only mitzvah lotas says that it's only concerned high, elevated soul is only affected by something negative, something that can pogea and low pagava, low naga, that it affects him personally. And
I wouldn't use that language. He doesn't say that language here.
Okay, right. Okay, so but it says there that he's not affected by mitzvah, and only affected by lotas. It's something he hates that will bother him, so to speak. It's something that will affect him. This is the shaman.
Well, let's put it this way. In the mush, let's start with you're talking the example or the moral that we learn from the example.
Well, I wanted to ask a question that seems to derive from that level, from those two levels. One that.
But let's talk. You're talking about in the example with the king, or you're talking about with God right now?
The example of the king.
So yeah, so he said that the king is merumam be'etzem, and that's why it's not teifus smokim. The smallest thing, whatever it says. What does he say here? Because there's nothing commensurate between him and the things you want to offer him. Yeah.
Right. But about the Bechid Halak,
Nitfis gam benefesh hamerumam, because also ki gam beremes hanefesh shadvar tainag ena teifus mokim, mekom mokim davar hara be'etzem teifus mokim shesana nafshe esa v'yigzer emer la'achike.
So,
right.
Right. So to me, that sounds like instead of an elevated soul of a king, an elevated so high that he doesn't nothing to really affect him, it sounds like the ultimate level of almost selfishness, because he doesn't care about bringing gilui to anybody else, doing tov to anybody else, to bringing chesed, which is the source of positive mitzvahs to anything. That doesn't bother him. He's not interested in that. But he is interested in when it's pageya, when it megiel to his himself, his own dislike. So doesn't that sound to me like, his own self-preservation is of interest to him, because he's only bothered when it hurts him, but he doesn't care about doing anything of chesed, of tov, of mitzvah. So doesn't that sound like a very selfish rather than a elevated neshama?
Well, if you read it properly inside, you wouldn't get that impression at all. He doesn't say he doesn't care. The words care and not care are not used here at all. That's why I said loy pagav v'leinag is not the right expression. What he's saying here is that he's fundamentally in a different place. So if you came to the Rebbe and you brought him, let's say, $1 million, it wouldn't matter to him, because he's a merumam be'etzem, and you can't grasp something that doesn't have any value to him. It's not because he doesn't care. He's just beyond it. The money doesn't matter to him. And same thing like a good piece of food or something else, It's like that story they tell when the Frierdiker Rebbe was crying by Schaefer, Rosh Hashanah one year. So there was a Yeka there. There was a German Jew, and he said to somebody, "Why is he crying? He has a beautiful wife. He has beautiful children. He has so many chassidim, a beautiful house. Why is he crying?" Couldn't understand why the Rebbe, Friedrich Rebbe, would be crying when everything seemed to have everything he needs in this world. So you're talking about someone that's on an exalted level that there's nothing you can do that's going to draw him, because not because he doesn't care, because he's not on that level. However, like you learn in Basel Ligani, one of the ways I explained this when we learned this was that when there's a menagid, the king will suddenly splurge all the eitzes, because the nitzachon to vanquish and overcome an opponent reaches etzem hanefesh, because this is something he decreed and he wants eliminated. And remember, if we're talking about a king, a benevolent king, we're not talking about a guy that just wants to kill his enemies. There's something about these enemies that challenge godliness, and that is when you vanquish and you take that cause upon, that will touch him, not because suddenly because he cares more about that, but because that reaches the etzem of who he is. So in other words, God will respond to something that is an anti-God, but it's not so much a mitzvah itself. He has to want to, as I explained, he has to want it, because there's nothing you can do for him, really. But something that opposes godliness, or in this case, like opposes this king, there, it says the words are, it's ma'eder something in him. The words are, what's the lashon? So yes, if it's a king that's just a selfish king, then it seems that way. But here we're not talking about someone like that. We're talking someone who's completely dedicated to the right cause. Now, I elaborated on this in a previous class. What does this mean? Why can't you say a mitzvah also? A mitzvah is also misyachis ala atzmus. God shows these mitzvahs, they're not just optional. He's the one that gave us tefillin or kashrus or Shabbos. So why is that not important to him?
Right.
So I explained what that meant when we spoke about this previous classes. But that's another discussion. That's the way I would explain this piece.
Okay, because just final follow-up on that. If you brought $1 million to the Rebbe, I would think that he would be excited about that, because he doesn't need the $1 million for himself. But I'm
not talking about for other causes. I'm talking about for him. He wouldn't be excited for him. It would mean nothing to him.
For him.
You're talking about, you're just, this is already semantics, because that would be because he wants it to help someone else. But I'm talking about if you try to say for him, I'm giving it to you personally. Most people would take the gift and be very happy. But that's because he's dedicated to the cause. So he wants to let it help other people. That's a different story. We're talking about here, and if you brought him a big fat steak to eat for dinner, use that example. Would that work? So you could say also, he'll give the steak to the poor people in the community. I got it. I understand. But that's not because the steak has any value to him.
Because Ahavas Yisrael, which is a positive mitzvah, is at the core. It seems to me that's the absolute core. That's the highest essence of a nasi, of a melech nefesh maruma. That Ahavas Yisrael, the concern for the other, rather than concern for my ideal.
Anyway, I suggest you look. Since I explained this already in previous classes, I think either listens to that. I suggest looking at Likutei Teda Pekudei, where he talks about this at length, why the negative is deeper than the positive. And I think you'll get an understanding. No one says Ahavas Yisrael doesn't reach high levels. That's not what we're discussing. But it's only going to reach Hamshacha that's commensurate to Ahavas Yisrael. It can't reach the Helam Atzmi, because it's a gilui. No matter how high it is, it's a structure. Ahavas Yisrael is a structured mitzvah. And a structured mitzvah will reach the highest level of giluim. Who says the highest level of giluim is not a high level? It's Eir Ein Sof. We even call it Atzmus of Eir Ein Sof. That's also great, but it's not the Helam Atzmi. It's not the divine that's beyond all structure and all revelation altogether. It's the divine in revelation. It's a very high level. Atzilus is also a very high level. For some reason, you feel that it's two separate things. This is mitzvah sesa touches the level of giluim, of structures, of revelations. It could be even Ein Sof revelations. Doesn't even say it's finite. It could be infinite, but it's still a form of revelation. And Leisha said, because if it's not, because it's refraining, because it's going and avoiding something, that reaches deeper, as he explains in Likutei Torah. Here he adds also the element of that it's marchikim v'deichim dvarim hasnuyim etzloi. He does add that element. That he doesn't say in Likutei Torah, I must say, as I said before.
Right. Thank you. That was okay. I got you. Thank you.
And one more thing I would say, it reaches the remus etzem because I will add this. I didn't say it explicitly, but I'll say it explicitly now. In Basiligani, when he speaks about Midas HaNetzachen, so as I said, why doesn't he splurge for his subjects when they're doing beautiful things for him? Let's say all the subjects of the king are coming and serving him with bittul and doing all kinds of things. Why doesn't he give them the eitras then? Why is it only when there's a war with the menagid? So I think the vart is like Avodah Zarah. Why is Avodah Zarah much worse than all other sins? Because once you touch Avodah Zarah, you're touching the etzem. It's like saying, are you accepting me as a king or are you going to someone else? Like the Egel Hazov. And that is not just a detail. I mean, you don't keep Shabbos. I'm sorry, you don't keep Shabbos or you don't do a mitzvah. So there, yes, you're not fulfilling what I want, which is my plan. But it's a negaya, the etzem of the, like Kablu Malchusay. Why is Avodah Zarah Yarug Val Yaver? You're supposed to die before you do it because you're touching the very etzem. The very etzem of Elikus. It's not about God's manifestation existence, whether God, you even accept whether God exists. And the enemies of God are basically, essentially defying the very essence of God. That's how I would explain, one of the reasons at least. Maybe there's other ways to explain it, why it reaches such a deep place. Because it's not just you're rejecting my commandments, you're rejecting me. And when you reject those that defy the very essence of God, that is what touches the Remus Etzem. It's like accepting God as king. And that is much more than just accepting what God wants you to do, which is the mitzvah sesa. That's what I would maybe add some explanation here.
Thank you. Very, very important. You're right that a Jew was only committed to give up his life for a negative, not for a positive, not for serving, say, Shabbos.
It's actually right. It's Avodah Zarah, Gilui Arayis, and Shvichas Damim. All loy sirtzach, you know.
Yeah.
Loy yelecha lekim acherim, and that's interesting. And loy sinaf, or whatever you call Gilui Arayis. Yeah.
Right. Only for Allah. Only for Allah. We're not committed to give up our life for pain.
Well, there's opinions. Some say you could, but you're not. You don't have to, but you could if you want to. But some say you're not allowed to.
Right, but even if you could, you're not mechuyev there. Whereas
right, correct.
Right. So that's the proof right there that allows are deeper because you're supposed to hide them. But when you talk about these three laws, you're committed to give them up. You're not even according to high but to give up your life because of an even deeper level of commitment to God, so to speak, connection to God. That's cleared up a lot.
Right. Okay, let's learn on. Any other questions before? Okay, so we learn on to the next paragraph on page 1299. So now he's continuing the explanation of the last verse in the Haftarah of the first day of Rosh Hashanah, which is the pasuk in Shmuel Aleph, Avaya Yechatem Merivov. The second part of it, he said, Olav b'shamayim Yira'im. And then he continues, Vayitan Eiz Lamalkei. And he gives strength to his king, V'yarim Keren Mashichei. And he lifts up the Keren which can be the crown. It can be, he's going to explain Keren in several different ways. The Keren, he lifts up the crown, the dignity of Mashiach, of his anointed one. So now he's going to explain the second half. If you may recall, if you go back to 1210, page 1210, he asked the question, what is the connection between the first half of the verse and the second half? I'm just reading from 1210. He said, we have to understand what's the connection between these. And also, what are these two statements? That he gives strength to his king and lifts the dignity or lifts the honor of his anointed ones, Mashiach. Just pointing out that he brought these questions. He's now going to bring back these verses, this section of the verse, the second half of the verse, and connecting it all to what we just learned. So it says, V'isa b'Zoyar, says in Zoyar, Vayikra, Daf Yutes Seif Amid Beis, giving us the exact page. Vayikra is volume 3, 19 at the end of the second page. Remember, the Zohar is written like Gemurah. There's a Daf and an Amud. So Daf 19, there's A and B. So at the end of B, Seif Amid Beis, says like this: Vayitan Eiz L'Malkai Da Kutchebrichu. This is referring to Kutchebrichu, God. V'Yarim Kerem Mashiach Da Knesset Yisrael. This is referring to Knesset Yisrael, the community of Israel, which is all the neshamas of Israel. Shamas Yisrael, Knesset Yisrael. Usually refers to Malchus. So Malchus is the Melech. Malchus is Kutchebrichu, and Mashiach is Knesset Yisrael. V'hainu. What does that mean? The Mashakasa Vayitan Eiz L'Malkai. It gives strength to Malkai. He Amshach B'Bchina Zah. He means that exact thing is referring to the transmission into the level of Zah. So if you remember HaKadosh Baruch Hu, when we say Kutchebricha V'Schinte, HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the Shechina, or in this case, Kutchebricha and Knesset Yisrael, is very often refers to the two levels of Zah and Malchus. So he says, Samshachim b'china Zah. Remember, we talked about Zah as being the place where it all begins, that the possibility of Havaya within Zah, and then there's the opposition of Gevurah to the Chesed of Havaya of Zah. So we'll soon see where he's going. So what does it mean? He's giving strength to the Melech, to Malkai, to Kutchebrichu. What does he mean? What is Zah on its own, and what is the strength that Zah is getting? Remember, we talked about the elevation of Zah to higher states. He's going to explain. V'hu inyan ba'atara she'atra le'imay, she'itra le'imay. This is the inyan of the crown that his mother crowned him with. If you recall, I'm going back now. It's a pasuk in Se'ena or Ena B'nai Tzion. The pasuk in Shir HaShirim. Let's just go back just to refer you, because it's all going to be connected to that. If you remember the difference we spoke about, Biti Achesi Imi, daughter, sister, mother. So we're talking now on page, let me find it. Goes back a while. Let me pull it up. Am I going too early? Oh no, okay, here. So he first mentioned this, if I recall correctly, I think he first mentioned this idea. I think I remember page 1248. I just want to find it inside here. 1 second. Yeah. On 1248, if you look there, the line that begins with B'chinas Malchus Dafka, So there he's talking about the higher elevation of Zah all the way to Moichin, all the way to Keser, Yichud Abba v'Ima Eloyin, or Yichud Abba v'Ima Pnimim, Zivug Shlim, that where Abba v'Ima are gazing at and connecting with the higher states, and that brings down a Chadash, a new energy. So he said, Yichud Pnimi Abba v'Ima Lahel Neshama Slajam Shama Atzmis, and the Tachas Havaron Lis Hamshah B'chinas Malchus, and he says, V'huin HaTorah she'otra le'imay b'yem chasanase dafke. So it's the crown that Zah, one second, the Hamshach b'Zah, let's say the Malchus dafke. Let's say the Hamshach b'Zah, let's say the Malchus dafke. That the crown he receives is for the purpose of Malchus. 1 second. Just refreshing my memory. 1 minute. Okay. And then on page 1249, if you may recall, he started speaking about the 3 levels of the Yichud of Avaya Adnai, Ibur, Yunika, Avaya Lakim, and Avaya Eya, godless. So he said these are the 3 levels. Biti Achesi Ima. Here we go. Okay. So if you recall, there he brings the Medrash. I think it's important to reiterate this, refresh our memories here. The emotional example for a king who had a daughter and he treasured her. He held her very precious. She was very dear. She was very dear to him. He continued loving Loizaz, meaning he continued persistently loved her until he called her my daughter. Then he continued loving until he called her my sister. And then he continued until he called her my mother, Imi. Same thing, the Eibishter first called Israel, the Jews, Bas, until he called them sister, Piskali Achesi, until he called them Imi. So he said there that refers to 3 levels of Malchus. Malchus refers to Neshamis, the king's daughter, is Malchus. So he says there are 3 levels of Malchus, Aliyah of Malchus. The first level, Malchus becomes like a daughter. I'm just reading inside there. Malchus is receiving from Zah. So then it's called a Bas. Okay, so that's the first level. Malchus is elevating to Zah. Okay. To be a makabel from Zah. Then comes the next level. Malchus gets equal. Again, I'm reading on page 1249. Near this end of the second paragraph there. When it comes equal, Biti is a daughter. So it's a recipient from Zah. Because then it's called sister. Malchus, and then Malchus also is receiving from Chabad like Zah is. And then there's even higher, Malchus goes up to become Imi, that is Mashpia in Zah. Like a mother that nurses her child. And then he explained the 3 levels in Avodah. I want to sum that up as well. We'll understand better what we're learning now. The first level of Avodah is when we are like an Eved. We're serving God like a Makabel. Bechinas Makabel hu inyan ha-mitzvahs. Mitzvahs are kelim. And we're following God's guidelines. And we have to do it b'Kabbalah seh, like a servant, like a bas, biti. Kabbalah seh Malchus Shamayim. I'm just looking. I'm summing it up, so that's why I'm taking a little time here. Avedis Eved, Yirav Kabbalas El. Yes, out of reverence and Kabbalas El, accepting the yoke, like an Eved that just Mekayim Ratzon HaMelech. He does not need to understand the Melech. He just has to accept and do what he's told. That's Malchus, the first Aliyah of Malchus, called daughter. The second is Malchus is elevating to sister, like he compares that, not to a servant, but to a minister of the king. The ministers of the king are involved in the strategy and in the brainstorming and actually passing laws, because they are, as he called them, like the Tanoim, the Yeyetze, the advisors of the king. In Avodah, that is like those that the Modei Torah, the people who are learning Torah, who God gave the power to develop Torah into Psak Halachas. They're not just being Mekayim. It's not just listening to what Torah says and fulfilling its mitzvahs. You're actually involved in the process of developing Torah. That's how he explained it there. So even though that person has to also fulfill God's will, he says, nevertheless, they're also somewhat like partners with God in the development of Torah. Evdei Hashem b'nishmosam, and that's the level of achesi. They're rooted in the levels of neshamas of Atzilus, achim v'reim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, they're called brothers and friends. So they're now commensurate to Kutchebrichu, meaning Zah. Okay. Good. One second. Okay. What is Imi? So on page 1251, Imi is the neshamas that are higher than Torah. How the neshamas are higher than Torah and they're mashpia in Torah. Level 2, the sister is equal to Torah. They're developing Torah, but they're not mashpia in Torah. So even Torah is moich Chabad. Now you mashpia in Torah. Let me see how he explains that. Then yeah. Yeah, but that's all moichin of Zah, Torah, because the moichin of determining what's kosher, what's not kosher, Chesed and Gevurah. Then he says, I'm trying to find the exact words, what it says in the Neshama. Then comes, you be mamshich higher, Eina Torah miskayemes ela b'misha memes atzmei. Torah is Zah, and that comes from a level that's higher. Like the Jews are elevating the Torah. And he said that ultimately is expressed most in Tshuva. That's on page 1252.
Is that Chiddush, though?
One second. So this is what the Jews are adding into Torah. They're mamshich atzmus chochmeh l'mayl meteira into Torah. That's when the neshamas are higher than Torah. Okay, it's page 1251, 52. They'll be mamshich etzem into Torah. That's what we learned here. Remember, we learned that neshamas are higher than Torah, and that's why neshamas have the power. If you remember, that's higher than just Torah mitzvah. Torah mitzvah is shmai. Neshamas is who, and they have the power to be mamshich and chadash and transform, and specifically through tshuva. Now I see the connection to all of it. He's bringing it all back together, and specifically he says, if you remember, the words he used was that where do you see? Where do you see that they're higher than Torah from tshuva? Because even if a person sins, tshuva, Torah could only tell you to bring a carbon, but it's only, but tshuva comes from a higher level than Torah. That's what he explains here on page 1252, and that's imi. That's the higher level of Imi. So now the Rebbe Rashab is bringing it all together again. That's why I wanted to review that. So he says, based on the Zohar, that Malchus is Kochebrichu and Mashiach is Knesset Yisrael. So he says, this is Bayitin Eiz LaMalchus. He's giving strength to the Melech. That's the Amshach into Zoh. And that's Batorah Shot Itrale Imay. The crown that the Imay, the mother, crowns Zoh. She Amshachas HaTorah, B'chinas Atzmos Ein Hashem Shalamayla Megeder Ishtalshlus. Zoh on its own is a certain level. But when you put a crown onto Zoh, that's coming from the mother, Imi, that's Mashpia into Zoh. It's Mashpia into Zoh, a deeper level, from where the Torah, Torah is a crown, comes from Atzmus Ein Sof. Remember, we learned all the way to Atzmus Shalamayla Megeder Ishtalshlus, higher than Ishtalshlus, than the very, even the realm of Ishtalshlus, of this cosmic order. Ad Gam B'Shar Sha'adisin B'Erein Sof Lifnei HaTzimtzum. Remember the two aliyahs, Garshayim, the Gershayim, all the way to Erein Sof before the L'mayla Gam B'chinas Shem Havai Sheba Atzmus. Higher than Shem Havai, even in Atzmus, even higher than Havai D'Leila. Hainu Gam B'chinas Eir Kameshu La'atzmai. Even higher than the Eir as it is to himself, which is a high level of Eir because it's higher than the Eir as it is to another, but it's still Eir. V'hu B'chinas Helam Eir. So V'yitin Eiz LaMalchus means that now that we're giving strength to Malchus, to Zoh, from higher than Ishtalshlus, all the way higher than the Tzimtzum, higher than Gilui altogether, all the way into the Helam Ha'er. V'zeu V'yitin Eiz. And this is the meaning that it gives strength. What's Eiz referred to? What strength? Hu b'chinas tigberes dafke. That comes from an intensity of Gevurah. Remember, we learned that Gevurah in its root is Helam. That intensity can only come from the concealment. The concealment requires tremendous amount of energy to conceal, and that's why it's so fundamentally concealed. And when you sweeten the Gevurahs, what is it? The Tagberas that comes from that place, that's a passionate place that creates an intensity. That's Vayitan Oiz. You're giving into Zoh, into Giluyim, you're giving the intensity that comes from the Helam Ha'er. Raksha Gevurah same b'chinas Oiz, v'koyach. He's not qualified. The Gevurahs themselves, they are in a state of Oiz, power and strength, or strength and power. Hainu b'chinas Gilui. So even though it's originating Helam Ha'er, but the Gevurahs now are manifesting in a revealed way. Like before, like for example, let's go back to the Tshuva, Baal Tshuva. The Baal Tshuva, what happens? Because he's transgressed, so now he's no longer, he's in a place that's out distanced from God, and then he comes and awakens and feels the tremendous thirst and the tremendous hunger and lack. And suddenly inside of him come these deeper resources. Where are the deeper resources coming from? The tzaddik, the person who never transgressed, he refrained from doing averos. So that took a certain measure of strength, fine. But here you need to find strength, such deep strength that is going to come only from a lack. You never have such strength unless you're in pain. Like you said before, pain, meitzah. It's only when you're in distress that you suddenly reach to places that are higher than Giluyim. Because Giluyim only give you the strength that you need when you need it. You can exert yourself and get a little more strength. When does a person access the deepest strengths within their soul? Like he said, Etzem HaNeshama, it's only when they're in dire straits, in real distress. When there's real distress, there's such a lack, such an emptiness, like a vacuum, that draws from the deepest places of the Helam Ha'atzmi. So the Gevurahs initially are in a state of Helam Ha'atzmi. Or he calls here Helam. He doesn't say Helam Ha'atzmi, sorry, just Helam. But Vayitan Oiz means that because there's been opponents, Merivav, Havai Yechata Merivav, these opponents elicited a need to go deeper, to Tkiyah Shefer, like we learned, going higher and higher, to draw all the way, not from Giluyim, because the transgressions
essentially neutralize the Giluyim. You know, like the Bnei Elikim could argue, what do you mean? Why are you doing chesed? The person sinned, he did transgressions. But you're going to a place like Moshe went to on Har Sinai, this week's Parsha, to a place that's beyond small and yamin, beyond chesed and gevurah, and all the way up to before the tzimtzum and tahu, which has not even been defined by any gilui altogether. There's no gilui. And when you draw from there, that comes an intense power that is an unprecedented intensity. That's when Vayitanez comes from Helama Eir. But now the Gevuras are coming full expression that the Cheli Yatir, that intensity of the tshuva that has been done, or the intensity that comes due to the distress, is now translated into power and strength. Lamalkoi. So chinas gila uliya sham shachu b'madrega shalamayla gam chinas moka lamoka leishtalshlus, and being that the transmission now is coming not from the regular flow, it's coming from higher, completely higher, being even higher than being a source, not even a source to a source of ishtalshlus, because it's completely beyond. Alkei nimshcha gili gam b'chinas zah. That's why the gili comes all the way down also into zah. Remember, the rule was the higher you go, the lower it goes. That's why, like the standing, upright position, that from the highest it comes all the way down to the lowest, exactly without the hierarchy, without the structured gradations. So you get from the highest all the way to Zah. Zah is called the Sof Elama Ein Sof, because Zah and Atzilus is like where Ein Sof ends, but it's called Sof, the end. This is the mature mind of Zah. That Zah gets now, it's the Moichin the Gadlus, that Zah actually catapulted Moichin upward. If you remember, Shalach to Shalach Hasa'im, all the way upward. Now it's coming back down into Zah, the full intensity from these highest levels. Okay. So really, we said this idea before. He's just putting it in now into the words, v'yorim, v'yitan eiz l'malkei. Is that clear, or any have any questions? Okay, so now comes the second half of the phrase. What about the Yoram Keren Mashiach? What is that? So he explains like this. The Yoram Keren Mashiach, he Amshacha b'Bchinas Malchus. Remember, Mashiach, the Zohar said, is Knesset Yisrael. This was all talking about Malkei, Kutchabrichu, which is Zoh. Now it's going to come down. Next level is Malchus. Keren Mashiach. That's the Amshach into Malchus. Mebchinas Helama Atzmi the Ein Sof Mamash. Oh, okay. Very clear. Till now, he did not use Helama Atzmi. In Zoh, you get the level of Helam, which is higher than Gili, fundamentally higher than Gili, but not Helama Atzmi. Now we're talking Helama Atzmi, the Ein Sof Mamash, v'hu shebchinas Malchus, tiye bebchinas Eir v'Gili mitzad Atzmi kanal. So now we're talking not just that the highest levels are going into Zoh, but now that Malchus itself is going to be in a state of Eir v'Gili mitzad Atzmi. The moon itself will radiate, not with the light of the sun, but its own power. V'zeu v'yorim keren Mashiach. And that's the meaning of the word keren, v'yorim keren Mashiach. Keren hu b'chinas ha'etzem.
I understand. We're going to ask the question, what's the difference between Helam and Helam Atzmi? So firstly, we discussed it and we learned it earlier, but I'll explain it again. I think it's important to understand the difference. But let's first read inside and then we'll discuss the difference. So Keren is B'chinas Etzem. So when you say the Keren of something, has many different meanings. We're going to explain later different meanings of Keren. One of them is, like we say, Keren and Peiris, the principal and the dividends. Keren Kayemes Le'elam Haba, we learned it earlier. So the principal is the Etzem money. That's why it's called Keren. And then comes the dividends, the Peiris that it yields, the interest or other profits it yields. Keren, in other places, is referred to the Keren like a horn. So Chassidus explains from the Rashba and other places that it refers to the etzem of something, you call it the Keren. So here he's referring to Keren as the level of etzem. Now remember, a horn is a bone, essentially. So etzem also means from the word bone, but bones like atzomes, when you say the bones of the person, atzomes is the very core skeleton. It's like the etzem of the very skeleton of a person are the bones. So bones are sometimes also referred to etzem in that sense. Here, obviously, he's not talking about a bone in any physical sense of the word. He's talking about the very core of it. So what does that mean? V'hainu, that etzem, the b'chinas Malchus, that the core of the level of Malchus, keren mishiche, not just mishiche, could have said vayorim mishiche, vayorim keren mishiche, that he's lifting, he's exalting, he's lifting up. The etzem of Malchus, Yisreimim, will be exalted, will be elevated, or Yisreim will be lifted up, via Sala, and elevated, bi'ili bi'yeser, a very high state of elevation. Well, who? And what is that? Shemasha Malchus, Yibchinis etzem choshuch, which means that which Malchus is fundamentally a dark state, etzem choshuch. It's an expression usually used on the moon, that the moon on its own is fundamentally a dark body. It has no light of its own. So Malchus, less lamagama klum, Malchus, which is be'etzem choshuch, Zoh has revelation. Chesed, Gevurah, Teferes, Netzach, Yisayid. Malchus is be'etzem choshuch, it will be in a state of gili. B'chinas eir, I should say. A state of eir, of revelation. Shezeu b'chinas eir atzmi, the b'chinas helama atzmi, the Ein Sof. This is the core eir, which is in the level of helama atzmi of Ein Sof. Now, of course, I'm right here. Everybody jumps at the contradiction. If it's helama atzmi, why are you calling it eir atzmi? Eir and helam, eir seems to indicate gilui. Helam is concealed, but he's using both of them together. Eir atzmi and the helama atzmi of Ein Sof. So I believe it'll be answered in the next few lines. So let's read it and then I'll explain. So he says, Shezeu gamkin inyan keren mishiche. So now you see he's using keren, he's putting a quotation mark, because keren, remember, like in this week's Pasha, keren oir ponov. Keren could also mean a beam of light. Keren means etzem, but it also means gilui. So I think he's trying to hint to Keren Mashiach, meaning the light, but not the light of Giluyim, the light of the Helam, Atzmi. Like beams of light, a ray. Keren is, when you say Karne Oyer, rays of light, or Karne Hoytera, the rays of Hoytera, of the glory of Tera. Kohos. Atzmi Shalah, will be mamish revealed. Will be, well, not mamish revealed. Say gili mamish will be literally in a real state. V'zeu l'maylo harbe be'ein, and this is infinitely higher mibchinas ha'eres v'agiluyim than the energies and the revelations, or the lights and the revelations. Rak masha etzem shalamayla b'chinas hamshacha legamri. that the etzem, which on its own is fundamentally higher than any form of expression or transmission and manifestation, and rak b'bchinas helam b'atzmusei, it's rather only in a state of fundamentally concealed within his essence. That very state, yeh b'chinas er v'gilui, that very state will be in a state of expression and revelation. And now he says something interesting. V'hainu, mashala osid tisala bas lamayla mebchinas imi. And this is the level when Bas, the daughter, Malchus, will become even higher than Imi. Remember, till now we're talking Bas, Achesi, Imi. Imi is Mashpi and Tazah. Now we're talking about Bas, which is in a state of recipient, which means it has no eir. It's only receiving from above it, will become higher than Imi. Rani v'simchi Bas Tzion, v'chinas Bas Tafke. Rani v'simchi, the daughter of Zion, will celebrate and celebrate and Rina v'simcha. What's the Rina v'simcha? Celebrate and another word for celebration. There's a word in English. I have to find the exact word.
Rejoice.
Rejoice. Let me explain what this means. But before I do, I want to just read till the end of the paragraph. Might as well read two more lines. Like it says in Zayar, Zayar has another section called Sisrei Teira, the secrets of Teira. Zayar has many sections, has Rai Mehemna, has Sifra Ditzniusa, has Idr Rabba. We've talked about different sections. So one of them is called Sisrei Teira. The Vayetze, in Vayetze page, Daf Kuf Nun Vav Ayin Beis, 156b. Loy sipuk lo da. My diikri imi karala b'shmei. It's not enough that he called her mother, but he called her by his name. In other words, isn't mother a high level? He says, no, it's not sufficient. It's not suffice. He called her by b'shmei, by his name, which is even higher than the level of mother. Because mother, if you remember, is still ima, bina, that's associated with chachma, it's a level. What's shmei? Not just shmei, that's lower than who, we're talking about shmei ha'atzmi, what he referred to earlier, helam ha'atzmi the Ein Sof, he called it yocheles ha'atzmus, the core concealed state of Ein Sof. And that concludes this paragraph at the bottom of this page. Now, it's far from over. The next page is going to start explaining what that means, BT. But let me explain, and I have explained this in the past, but I think it's worth repeating. Let's begin with the introduction I always start with. We are so accustomed to the world of Gilui, of revelation, that that's the only thing we truly value until we're made aware that that's not the case. Because everything for us is, if I see it, if I experience it, if I express it, then it's there. If it's hidden, we see it as something of somewhat of a deficiency. But that's not the case at all. Remember, Giluyim by definition are expressions. There's a state, when you talk about God, he's higher than any form of expression. Expression is a chiddush. We are on the other end of the spectrum, down below, so for us, Gilui is everything. But let's first talk on a human level. How much of the real essence of who you are is revealed? As we discussed, consciousness only goes that far. Super consciousness reaches places we ourselves are not always aware of. So fine, what you express to another ostensibly could be very external, surface, superficial expression. What's going on, that's like your speech and your actions. What's going on in your thoughts, you keep to yourself. You may have a secret. You may have all kinds of things going on in your own inner self. But then there are things that even you yourself may not be aware of. which is your like etzem, which is not your machshava. When you're thinking, at least you're aware of what you're keeping to yourself. Like we learned earlier, gilui la'atzmei, but it's a gilui, except it's to you, not to another. When we really get to know someone, or when we get to even know ourselves, so my question would be, how far do you go? So Chassidus explains that there's a place where you yourself are not conscious of, and more than that, there's a place that's completely beyond consciousness altogether. And who says Gilui is even a value there? Gilui is a value in the world of Giluyim, in the world of expression, the world of revelation, the world of... Now, we know that's relevant because to say, for example, I'm a good Jew at heart, the etzem is not enough. We know God wants us to bring it into action, like the Alter Rebbe told that Chassid. Said, why aren't you learning? He says, Rebbe, you know I could be a Gaon. I can learn any time and be a Gaon, and be a genius, a scholar. And the Alter Rebbe told him, just like a Ganef, a thief is not someone who could be a thief, but is a thief. A Gaon is not someone who could be a Gaon, but one is a Gaon, which means you have to actualize it. So we all understand the value and the importance of Amaiso Iker, actualizing, revealing, expressing. What would we be like if our teachers didn't express themselves and didn't communicate? If the Rebbe didn't fabreng with us, didn't reveal himself to us? So we understand the value of Gevurah. But when we start learning Chassidus, we start appreciating that the other world of Etzem is far deeper, far more intimate, and actually there are states that are concealed, but they could be revealed. And then there are states that are completely beyond revelation. And it's very hard to really understand these levels of Chassidus. We talk about Helam and Helam Ha'atzmi, unless you get comfortable with this. Which is why when you start learning Chassidus, you don't begin with this. It's almost impossible to fully wrap our heads around it. First, you have to appreciate Giluyim before you can appreciate Helam. Like someone will say, okay, I marry someone. I love that spouse of mine. But the first thing is you appreciate the things you appreciate. And then there's elements that are the mystique, the things you'll never understand, the things that remain beyond. So Giluyim are necessary. You can't really begin if you don't have some form of holding on to something, some handle. But then you begin to understand, one second, my teacher has been teaching me the Rebbe. Okay, he brilliantly explained ideas. Then you come to understand, one second, whatever he explained, there's a lot more that he didn't tell us. Or there's a lot more that remains fundamentally beyond me, higher and higher and higher. Now, the question is, how deep down the rabbit hole can we go? The answer is, it's endless. Like we said, just like lamata mata aden tachlis, lamay lamay aden ketz. Like we learned just in Basaligani from the Kunizea. Just like God can reveal himself more and more and more all the way to the lowest levels, he also, lamay lamay aden ketz, is endless. How deep is our etzem? How could we ever know? Especially when you can't measure it and when it completely defies any type of revelation. Now, really, mainstream Yiddishkeit, Judaism, would have probably argued, and not probably, that that's beyond us. That's what we say. We don't have access. Malafonim, mala'oche, ein lanu esek b'nistaris. We can't go into the secrets of God. Lo machshavei seichem. His thoughts are not your thoughts, etc., etc. And this is the areas that are off limits, basically. But Chassidus is very, I don't want to say the word greedy, but Chassidus comes and says, no, the Eibishter wanted a full relationship with us, not just a relationship on the level of Giluyim, that something that's in common between us, but also a relationship with the things that are not in common. We also want we want to be able to also experience that which is beyond experience, literally. But to fully understand it is very difficult, because as soon as you call it an experience, you could argue, okay, it's already hit the world of Giluyim. It's no longer the thing itself. As soon as you're aware, says no. Remember, Atzmus is not limited to that. Ultimately, because Atzmus is not limited by Giluyim, obviously, and he's not even limited by Helam, he can make a situation when we go through all the stages and first appreciate all the Giluyim of godliness, and we understand the things that are the mysterious, the mystique of God, that which is beyond, and even the beyond, all the way as far as we can go, the Eibishter does something. He says, you go that far and you reach into the deepest part of me, I will do a miracle. For us, it's a miracle, not for him. the paradox of revealing the unrevealable, of ultimately expressing the inexpressible. Not just the inexpressible that yesterday was inexpressible, but fundamentally beyond. You will experience something about me that does not make sense in the world of logic and giluyim. You'll experience my etzem, not just my gilui. Now, what reflects more etzem, helam atzmi or gilui atzmi? The truth is, gilui also reveals godliness, but it reveals godliness by definition, by expression. As soon as by expression, it has to have parameters, even if it's a gilui la'atzmi, as we learned earlier. Helam, by definition, because it doesn't have any expression, it can reveal more, so to speak, reveal. It can express more of atzmus. In other words, the concealment of the divine in some ways expresses more of atzmus than the revelation of the divine. However, it's not revealed to us. And that too, he says, will ultimately be revealed. But the challenge here is, the only way to get there is through our own concealment, through dealing with the concealments of the nefesh habamis, with transgressions, with the hell and behester of golus, with distress. So ultimately, it's the darkest darkness of our existence that ultimately leads us to the darkest darkness, l'mal yusa, of the helam ha'atzmi above, and that this very darkness can be ultimately redeemed and express that helam ha'atzmi. So is it called gilui or is it called helam? The truth is, as you see here, he keeps referring to the helam ha'atzmi, but the helam ha'atzmi will be expressed. So it'll be expressed just as giluim are expressed, but it won't be a gilui that's expressed. It'll be that inner core that's expressed. So you could ask the question, will it be on my terms, on our terms, or on God's terms? You have to say it's on God's terms, and we've come to a point, we've elevated to a point that we can receive it. Because if it's still on our terms, then it's giluyim. You want it to be on God's terms, but in a way that we have gone through enough avodah and bittul and sublimation and essentially transcending ourselves and getting out of our own way, getting out of the ego and all of the need for giluyim, that then when you are standing in that way, like I said, you'll see me when you don't look. When you don't look, then suddenly that etzem will manifest in you. Now, you want to have the cake, people want their cake and eat it too. It's not going to work that way. It has to have a tremendous level of bittul that can only come from distress and the tshuva that comes from it that allows a person to experience that. Now, what does it look like? The closest I think I can describe it is in the world of recovery. It looks like people who have that aura and glow that comes only after a lot of pain. They're able to get through pain to a point where they were able to transform it into something that made them into extremely refined people. Now we know it's higher than regular giluyim. It's coming from a very dark place, but that darkness has turned them into very high, very refined and higher level people. That's just, in my opinion, an example of it psychologically. I'm sure there are more examples of it. A true Baal Tshuva is on that level. Or other ways where we've taken something negative and turned it into a positive would also be an expression of a helam that became a gilui, as opposed to a gilui that just became more revealed. That's just briefly, somewhat, some explanation of these ideas. A lot more to be said. I do know that we're going to learn more about it inside from the Rebbe Rashab. So I'll definitely elaborate more, but I just wanted to, I've said some of this before, so it may not be new to you, but I think because of its abstract nature, and it's so beyond our regular tools, the more we say it, the more we discuss it, the better it is. And I hope I did some justice, but the truth is you got to keep thinking and thinking and thinking. It's the gilui of etzem, and when you hear Chassidus, the etzem begilui. The atzmus is baruch will be begili. Now remember, atzmus is higher than helam atzmi and higher than gilui too. Atzmus, pure atzmus. Here we're talking about helam atzmi as being the closest thing that expresses God's beyondness, God's completely being beyond. Where giluyim express God in somewhat that is commensurate and relates to us in some way. You could say, mitzvah sesa, mitzvah leisa express the two, tshuva even higher. And that's why he says helam on Zah, but he says helam ha'atzmi on Malchus. Because helam still is concealed, and I think he said earlier, it's concealed beyond Gilui, but it's not the Helam Atzmi like the Shmoya Atzmi and the Yechelis Atzmus, which is more Atzmistic than the Helam alone, even though the Helam is also higher than Gilui. I could elaborate on that as well, but suffice for now. We'll stop here. I'll talk about that maybe tomorrow. Okay,
this is so powerful and Pashut amazing. But why can't you say it also on Atzmus itself?
Say what?
That you reach, like you said about Helam Atzmi, Choiles.
Well,
same thing. Reach the Atzmus itself.
Well, two things. First of all, the word reach and Atzmus maybe don't go together. And two, maybe when you do this, when you come to the Gilui, you let's say you reach your maximum in Giluim, then you reach your maximum in Helam, essentially that is experience of Atzmus, because you're getting both Kavim as they become one, and it's only Atzmus that really joins them together. So I would say you do reach, but it's through these two, like Lamaila and Kesamat, you need both to get there. Remember, the challenge is not from Atzmus' point of view. Atzmus can do whatever he wants. The point is, can we contain it? And in a way that we don't become completely annihilated. Remember, the goal here is not, if you're annihilated and completely burned up by it, that's no chiddush. That was there before existence. It has to be that we have earned our way there. And the Helam Asmi allows us to experience the Atzmus, so-called the levels that are beyond Gilui. And I think when you have Gilui and then the Helam Asmi, you essentially are going to be experiencing Atzmus to some extent, as much as one could say that those words. That's how I would say it. But you see, these are words. The question is what it means in Aveda. What does it actually mean in our lives? You know? We need to talk a lot more about Atzmi, what Atzmi really is. Because Helama Atzmi is hard enough to understand. Atzmi is even beyond Helama Atzmi. But, you know, I think as we learn, we'll discuss it. I don't want to turn this mathematical. Like, you know, you get to Gilui and Helam and then Atzmus. It has to be internalized in some way. Yeah. Yeah, this is very powerful stuff. Very, very. I mean, you see now why this is volume 3 of Ayin Beis. The Rebbe Rashab, as deep as the beginning of Ayin Beis was, and it was very deep, he's now going all the way up. We're reaching the peak of Mount Everest and beyond, where no man has ever tread. How do you like that?
Yeah, he's squandering the ultimate jewels here. He's giving them out.
Yeah.
Maybe you said that if we go deeper, this level of Elamite.
You may be muted. I don't know if anybody's speaking.
Much more God that we don't know about it.
Can't hear you. What did you say, Eliezer?
Then we'll see, would be infinitely greater than that's through revelation. Anything that could be revealed to us. Obviously, the Elamite contains so much more, infinite more than we can access. And the revelation can still access that somehow by, as you said at the end, through a miracle. If you keep going, maybe Hashem will reveal it. Very inspiring.
Yeah, it's very. Anybody want to ask anything or any?
Just want to express my thanks because this is so overwhelming, this kind of a topic, and the way that you brought it down in, I don't know, this is such kind of a situation that you brought it down clear.
Thank you. Thank you. I think I see the next page is going to be very interesting. He's going to explain the mila of Bas Eved over a Sar. Wow. Yeah. A servant over a minister. Look, it ultimately comes down to the things we always learn about Dir b'Tachtenim, that Dafkin Tachtenim, we have Atzmus. It's Dafkin the darkest and the biggest hell, the Yesh, Hanivra, we have the Yesh Amiti. But you can't get there without the Giluyim. That's the interesting thing. I remember when I first started learning these topics, when I was like a bocher. So, it's so exciting to hear about Atzmus and how we reach those highest levels. And I used to wonder, why do we need to learn about all these levels? Who cares about Ak and Kav and Ak and Kudim, Nekudim, Atzilas, Bri, Yetzira, Asiyah, Chochmah, Bina, Zah, Malchus. I really almost felt that when you learned that in the Maimarim, it looked to me like, I don't want to say trivial, but it was like, it didn't compare to Atzmus. And it's only when you really start learning more, you realize the interesting way God made it, that you can only appreciate Etzem if you appreciate Giluyim. It's like you can't learn the mystery if you don't first learn what you know. You can't learn about the secrets of something if you don't first figure out what you can understand from. Then when you do, you come to realize, oh, wow, there's a real secret going on here. So just to say to somebody at, let's say, 15 years old, 20 years old, hey, Etzem, it's higher than everything. It's very nice, but it doesn't have the same appreciation like an adult that's gone through life and experience and through the different Giluyim and Halamas that you suddenly then really realize the real mystery, the real secret of it is only understandable or only appreciated really once you've gone through the levels, and there's no shortcut. You just can't cut to that. Yes, there are moments like Yom Kippur, Baal Tshuva, different experiences you can leap. But at the end of the day, to really experience it, that's the paradox, that Giluyim train you to experience that which is beyond Giluyim. That's another way of putting it. And then when you do that, that's mind-blowing. Just wanted to throw that into the equation. Yeah. Okay, so we end here, we'll stop here at the end of the paragraph. End of page 1299, literally. And tomorrow we'll start on 1300. Okay? 13, bar mitzvah 100. 100 times 13. Page 1300 of Ayin Beis. Who would believe? Wow. And just for the record, we got another, let's see. Another 179 pages to go. Okay. Going to be 1479. So we'll stop here. As I pointed out, by the way, now all the manuscripts of the Rebbe Rashab have been posted online. You can literally see it all in Rebbe Rashab's handwriting. I don't know if I posted on the group. I'll post it. It's quite something to see how the Rebbe Rashab puts this on paper. That's something else.
This is unbelievable thing. How could you get it? Which website?
I'll send a link. I'll put a link on the group.